and welcome back to this run-through of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. This is the second part of the second book and is probably one of my most favourite parts of the entire work. What have we done so far? If you haven't seen the first part of the second book, please go and watch that video, because what we saw there was that we are naturally constituted to receive the virtues, but they have to be developed. And how are they developed? Well, they're cultivated through practice and exercise. It's a long and difficult developmental road. One of the suggestions that Aristotle gives here is that we become just by performing just acts. And we saw how this, although it may appear superficially circular, it isn't, because what he means is that to develop the right habits leads you to then develop the right dispositions. So beginnings are very important. How you habituate yourself to behave is very important, because it leads you where you're going to go. We saw that virtue is a disposition with which a particular feeling is associated, the right feeling. And now we're just at the start of the Doctrine of the Mean. The Doctrine of the Mean is one of the most well-known parts of Aristotelian theory. It's a very common question in undergraduate philosophy exams. You know, what is Aristotle's Doctrine of the Mean and why is it not a doctrine of moderation? It's quite easy to misunderstand, and you can give quite a superficial answer to why it's not a doctrine of moderation. It's a shame that it's such a popular question, because sometimes I think it leads students to miss out on why it's such an important part of the book, and why there is a really strong argument behind the Doctrine of the Mean, other than the superficial misunderstanding of it as a doctrine of moderation. So to start off with, it has nothing to do with moderation, so let's leave that to one side and look at it as a much more interesting idea that it is. Okay, Aristotle starts off by saying, when he talks about mean, he doesn't talk about an equidistant point. So, let's get rid of this. Okay, so you could have a mathematical mean. You could have this mathematical mean is in the middle. That is not what he means, okay? He never intends this. By mean, he means the right amount relative to the person and the situation. So ask a general question like, how much food should be consumed? You can't really answer that question unless you know by whom, what for. Yeah? Who is the person who's going to be consuming the food? What are they aiming at? What is the food for? So an athlete would presumably consume completely different quantities of food than a non-athlete, and you could even ask what kind of athlete. A long-distance runner would consume different amounts and different kinds of food from a weightlifter, for example. A long-distance runner in training would consume different amounts and kinds of food than a long-distance runner who's taking a break. The answer to what kind of food should be consumed cannot be given unless you have all these kinds of details. And this is the way in which the Doctrine of the Mean is a mean. It is a mean in respect to being relative to the person and the situation. In a sense, calling it a Doctrine of the Mean is mistaken. I don't really like the translation, even though it might be accurate in terms of the words that Aristotle used. Think of it as a doctrine of appropriateness. It says that the right amount is the appropriate amount, and that the appropriate amount cannot be known in abstraction from the particulars of the situation. You have to tell me, who is it who's going to be eating the food? How old are they? What are they working towards? What are the current nutritional needs? Do they need to put on weight, lose weight? Do they expend a lot of energy? Are they in training? What are their goals? Are they looking to win the Olympics or do a Netflix marathon? Okay. All these things have to be known before you know what the mean is. So it's a doctrine of appropriateness rather than a mathematical mean. And be careful here with the word relative as well. If you're confused about moral relativism and moral objectivism, please stop here and go and watch the video on why morality is not relative. Otherwise, you're going to get even more confused at the moment. Aristotle is not a moral relativist. he's not making the metaphysical position that there is no moral truth of the matter. There is an answer to what is the right thing to do, in the same way as there is an answer to how much food should be consumed by this person engaged in this activity at this moment of time with these goals. Once you specify the particulars, there is an answer to how much food should be consumed. And the same is true for the moral questions. What should I do here is relative to the particulars of the situation. But once these are known, there is a correct answer. So he's not a relativist, metaphysically speaking. He's an objectivist. There is a truth of the matter here. And the use of the word relative is not a metaphysical claim about the nature of moral truth. Okay? So the answer is relative to the individual, which means you need to know about the individual before you can figure out what is the right thing to do in this particular situation. Okay. And he says that we can see the same sort of argument with all sorts of sciences and activities. In any science and in any activity, perfection is the mean. So the mean is not a kind of amount, a middle sort of kind of amount. Do a little bit and then it's going to be okay because you didn't do nothing and you didn't do too much. No, it is always the perfect kind of amount, and he's making a conceptual point here. If you have the right kind of amount, going a bit below ruins it. If you have the right amount, going a bit above ruins it. So the right amount is the right amount, and it can be ruined by both excess and deficiency. So in everything, the right amount is the right amount. That bit is a little bit circular, but not in a problematic way. He's trying to define what it means for something to be exactly right. And conceptually, it means for it to be on target. Not too much, not too little. So moral virtue, like many other activities in sciences, is concerned with feelings and it's concerned with actions. And these are the kinds of things that we can have too much or too little of. And he writes, and this is a rather famous quote that captures everything he has to say in this section of the book: to have these feelings, the feelings associated with virtue, at the right times, on the right grounds, grounds for the right reasons, towards the right people, for the right motive, and in the right way, is to feel them to an intermediate, that is, to a best degree. How can the degree be both intermediate and best? It is best because virtue is an excellence, and it is intermediate because too much or too little ruins it. Okay, so it can be both intermediate and best. In terms of quality, it is the best. In terms of conception, where it is to be found, it is to be found between too little and too much. Let me give you an example. Anger. Anger can be righteous indignation. The term righteous indignation captures exactly this idea that it was the right amount of anger at the right amount of time towards the right amount of people and for the right reason. Suppose the fascists have just stormed to the seat of your democratic government, trying to upturn democratic election results. How much anger should you be feeling when you're faced with this? Too little anger seems the wrong amount, doesn't it? If you're sitting there going, a little bit bothered by this, but not too much, we want to say, what's wrong with you? Have you seen what they did? And we appeal to the particulars to explain why a lot of anger is the right kind of thing. We appeal to the fact that these were Nazis, that they were trying to overturn the democratic process, that they stormed the democratic institutions, trying to terrorize people into changing their minds and into withdrawing the legitimate election results. When I say all these things, you should be feeling angry, because these are angry-making things. The right amount of anger is quite a lot of anger. Having said that, I'm sure there is a certain amount of anger that goes even too much, even for this kind of situation, where a lot of anger is the correct amount of anger. You can still get it wrong. You can still go a little bit overboard, even though quite a lot is the right amount of anger. And remember, the amount of anger that is appropriate for the particular situation will depend on the situation, on yourself. If you see a group of kids that walk on your front lawn, even though you've put a sign up that says don't walk on my front lawn, okay, it's okay to get angry, but presumably only a little bit of anger is justified here. If you feel the same sort of anger as you felt in the previous example, you're clearly exaggerating, like grossly exaggerating, to the point where we feel you have a perverted perception of reality. How can you be as angry about somebody walking on your lawn as you were about fascists trying to overturn a legitimate democratic election? Okay, and we appeal to the details of the case to explain why a little bit of anger is the correct and best amount. In the grass case, quite a lot of anger is the correct and best amount in the storming of the democratic institutions case. So really the doctrine of the me is a doctrine of appropriateness of feeling and action. And he makes a conceptual point that the appropriate amount of feeling, the appropriate action will lie between an excess and a deficient. You can get it wrong by doing too much or too little, and it will be the best, it will be the highest, it will be an excellence in terms of it being the correct feeling and the correct action. Okay, and then Aristotle says, given all this, failure is going to be possible in many ways. If you're looking for the center of a circle, there is only one point which is correct, but there are many, many points that are going to be wrong all over the place. Yeah, you can get it wrong by misjudging all these different particulars that go towards making a decision. But to get it right, there is only one way to get it right. That's why it's very easy to fail, but very difficult to succeed. And he comes now to the definition of virtue. Again, a really, really important quote from the book. Virtue is a purposive disposition lying in a mean, it is relative to us and the situation, and determined by the right reason, and by that which the virtuous person would use to determine it. Let's look at it more slowly. So virtue is a purposive disposition. What is a disposition? A disposition is a character trait that is stable, reliable, and goes on for a long time and always reacts in the same way to the same kinds of prompts. So a disposition to be kind is a character trait to respond with kindness to multiple repeated situations where kindness is required. Every time there is a situation that requires kindness, you have the sort of character trait that responds to that. And this is a disposition. It's not a one-off, it's not a fluke, and it is purposive. That means it has been cultivated on purpose because you have acknowledged it is a good thing for you to become kind. This is where you committed to doing kind acts and developing kind habits before you were even kind, because you wanted this goal. Okay, so it's a purposive disposition. You're not doing it by mistake or by accident. You're doing it on purpose. You've cultivated this disposition on purpose. So it's a purposive disposition lying in a mean. It is to be found conceptually in the appropriate amount, in the not too much and the not too little, but the just right. And that amount is going to be relative to us and relative to the situation. This is the point about the food. How much food should you consume depends on who you are, what are you training for, what is your exercise level, what are your dietary goals, all these kinds of information, right? And determined by the right reason. He hasn't introduced this too much before, but the right reason is the reason that comes out of all these particulars. When I ask you, why were you really angry? You say, because they are right-wing fascists attempting to overturn a legitimate democratic election. That's the right reason in this case. That gives you all the information to make the judgment that you should be very, very angry. And this right reason is determined by the virtuous agent. The virtuous agent is the person who has gone through a long period of habituation exercise, development, training, and education of the virtues. And he has arrived at the point where he has the moral perception and the practical wisdom that allow him to make these kinds of judgments about the right reason, to see what is wrong with Nazis storming the democratic institutions, trying to overcome democratic elections. Okay, I know I introduced quite a lot there that Aristotle hasn't discussed as yet, but we'll come back to look at what moral perception, what practical wisdom are later on. He does not discuss these concepts now. I've introduced them to you just to give you a glimmer of what's coming up. There's quite a lot more information to come on these things. For the moment, he still concentrates on the doctrine of the mean, the doctrine of appropriateness, that you have to have the right feeling in order to produce the right action. And this is where virtue is to be found, in getting it right on the target instead of going too much or too little. Now he has a caveat to this idea, and he says that not every feeling and not every action admits of a mean. Some are just wrong. Some, like, for example, feelings of malice or envy, cannot be said to be right and have a too much or too little. To be envious is just wrong. You can't be envious to the right amount, towards the right person at the right time, because envy in itself has a negative valence. It means to feel, to have malicious feelings towards the achievements and the accomplishments of other people, such that you want to bring them down. Okay. And there are some actions which equally do not admit to a mean, like murder. You cannot say that there is a too much murder or too little murder, or a good murder, or some circumstances where murder is a good thing, exactly because of how we define murder, which is the unjustified taking of a life. Okay, now he's going to give us a little bit more help with how we determine the mean. But he says that he can't give us a generalization, because of the details of the situation. Remember, he has warned us that our subject matter, ethics, is going to be very complex. It's going to be full of details. It cannot be captured in one rule or one principle. So if he's going to tell us more about what is the mean, he's going to have to give us a lot of details about particular virtues and particular situations. So, conceptually, we have the one virtue and the two vices. We have a vice of extreme and we have a vice of deficiency. So if you take the feeling of fear, write that down for me. So the feeling is fear. With respect to fear, what do we have in terms of the mean? Courage. This is the appropriate amount of fear. Notice that here, courage doesn't mean having no fear. It means having the appropriate amount of fear with respect to the situation. Okay? And what is the excess? What happens if you have too much fear? You become cowardly. Okay? Too much fear makes you run away when you should be standing your ground and be courageous. How about too little fear? Rashness. With too little fear, you run in where even the courageous stop. You go everywhere because you just don't have the regulation of the appropriate amount of fear. So all of these are opposed to each other. Yeah. First of all, cowardice is opposed to rashness. These are two opposites. But both together are opposed to courage, because both are vices. Vice here, and virtue only here. Okay. Now, some of these are more opposed to the virtue than others. We generally tend to err when it comes to fear by having too much rather than too little. This is a psychological point that seems plausible. Therefore, we generally tend to think that the contrast is between these two, because most of us tend to err by being cowardly rather than being rash. And this, Aristotle says, is perfectly fine in how we understand the relation between these things. keep remembering that this is not a mathematical or statistical mean. You don't have to put courage in the exact middle between cowardice and rashness. It could be that in this case with fear, you have cowardice here a long way before you get to courage, and only a little bit before you end up to rashness. Yeah? Could be that finding this particular mean of appropriateness here means that you have to be really opposed to too much fear, really bringing your fear levels quite low down. You can still go wrong by going too far in the other direction, but in this particular case of this particular virtue, where we tend to have a natural propensity to feel too much fear, maybe the cowardly is more juxtaposed to the courageous. This is a point about human psychology. You can say the same thing about pleasures. We are much more likely to indulge in our pleasures than to withhold from our pleasures too much. So temperance, if we have pleasures, and our response to pleasures is the feeling. Yeah? Temperance is the virtue, and licentiousness is the vice of too much, and most people will fall towards this vice. They will indulge in too much chocolate rather than what is the insensibilities, the other vice, rather than being completely insensible to the pleasures of chocolate. Okay? So psychologically, when it comes to pleasures, we're much more likely to fall towards this kind of vice. And Aristotle is really interested in these psychological facts because he's interested in giving us advice for a long character developmental journey. And he wants to know what human beings are like. That naturally, that from our temperament, we tend to be the kind of beings that indulge in pleasure, that feel fear, that find fear difficult to resist, that find pleasure difficult to resist. So we're much more likely to go in this direction and err towards overindulgence than be indifferent to pleasures. Okay. Finally, the mean, the appropriate amount, can be very difficult to determine. Anyone can get angry. It's really easy to let your emotions of anger just go loose. But that's not what Aristotle is suggesting. If you're going to be angry at the right time towards the right people for the right reasons and in the right way, there's quite a targeted approach to anger. And it takes a long time to teach yourself how to recognize the situations where you ought to be angry, how to judge that this is the kind of place to be angry, and to also teach your emotions to respond in the appropriate way and not overwhelm any of these judgments you may have had about what is the appropriate amount of anger. And Aristotle finishes book 2 with some practical recommendations on how to do this. So this is really, truly a very practical theory. He doesn't just talk about the necessity to become virtuous, he tells us ways in which education could be different. The way we approach our lives could be different. And here are some practical ideas with respect to the doctrine of the mean, the doctrine of appropriateness, how to find the mean. Keep away from the extreme which is most contrary to the mean. Like we've seen here, cowardice and licentiousness are more contrary to the vice. So try to keep away from too much fear and too much indulgence in pleasures, because you know this is where you will naturally be gravitating towards. Be aware of your mistakes. You have to reflect on how you behaved in the past. You have to figure out where you made a mistake. And next time you need to drag yourself in the opposite direction. When you find yourself overwhelmed with desire for that chocolate, even if you eat it on this occasion, the next time you have to try and put some barriers in place perhaps so you can't get to the chocolate. Obviously eating chocolate is not a moral example, but it's a good analogy for these kinds of things. Similarly, you find yourself too fearful when it's time for you to stand up and speak against the bullies. Well, next time try to strengthen your resolve. Try to find situations that are easier for you to act, to build these sorts of habits so that you become less fearful in the future. And you should guard particularly against pleasure, because pleasure is one of the things that we are particularly vulnerable to. Now, one thing he's done in this part of Book 2, which I haven't touched upon at all, is give us a list of virtues and vices. There's a list of possible feelings, like pleasure, anger, loads of other ones. A list of virtues that correspond to that feeling, and then vices of excess and vices of deficiency to go with everything. I haven't gone through them because I think it would be a bit dull. You can just open your version of the Nicomachean Ethics and just read the list. The next thing he's going to do is talk about each one of these virtues and associated vices of excess and deficiency in detail. So we'll do that next, and we start looking at each one in turn and what he has to say about them. So we'll stop here. Thank you very much for listening. See you next time.